I'll call the meeting to order at 5:38 p.m. Introduction of amendments.
Through Deputy Mayor, I have none.
Confirmation of the agenda, that the agenda for the special council meeting of December 15th, 2020 be approved as presented. Moved by Councillor Bath, seconded by Councillor Lego. All in favor? Declarations of pecuniary interest.
Through Deputy Mayor, I have none.
And there's one item on the agenda tonight, and that is, forgive me if I pronounce your last name right, Chaz. That's Chaz Anselmo with KPMG, and he's here to provide us an overview of the service delivery review. And I'll give you the floor, Chaz.
Great, thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. Very close. It's Anselmo, but hey, listen, I've been called much worse. Good evening, everyone. Just by way of a formal introduction, my name is Chaz Anselmo. I'm a senior manager with KPMG in our Sudbury offices. And for the purposes of the service delivery review, as well as the organizational review, I was the engagement lead. I believe that everyone has a copy of the presentation that I'd like to go through this evening, and I'll sort of walk through both of these reviews, as well as then have the opportunity to answer any of your questions. So in terms of the review in itself, and on the second slide, we've established a bit of an agenda for this evening's purposes. I'd like to talk about the objectives of the review. So what did we set out to accomplish? Walk through some of the key findings and give you some sense as to what we saw when we took a look as to not only the complement of services that the municipality Sioux Lookout provides, as well as the organizational structure that it has in place to go about in delivering those services, as well as then talk about the potential courses of action and where we see there's opportunity for change for the municipality's consideration moving forward. And as I said, provide an opportunity for members of council to ask questions as to the results of these two projects. On the third slide within your deck, what you'll see is the objectives and again, what we sought out to accomplish. And the first and foremost was to take a step back and look at the current service offerings that are provided by your municipality. And I'll go into this into further detail in a subsequent slide, but really sort of, once again, looking at the inventory as to everything that you do and how you go about in doing that. At the same time, what we were looking at is the structure. So how do portfolios get assigned? How does information flow? Where do responsibilities lie across the organization? And taking a look at that with a view as to, could there potentially be a way to streamline that within your organization? Talking about streamlining sort of segues very nicely into the third point inside that slide. And that really looks at the concept of operational effectiveness and efficiency. And one aspect of the service review is to take a series of processes and break them down by work step. And I'll speak to that further later on. And then ultimately to take all of that information and all of that analysis that was developed as part of the first three bullet points and identify potential opportunities for change. And this looks at how you could potentially increase upon operational effectiveness and efficiency, whether or not there's opportunities for cost savings. And from an organizational standpoint, could you potentially change things to become more effective and efficient in your decision making as well? The fourth slide looks at the scope of work. So these are the major work steps that we performed over several months. And the first is the development of service profiles. And what you'll see inside the service review, a service delivery review report in an appendice is a series of municipal service profiles. And before I go any further, when we talk about service profiles and the development of these are really an opportunity to provide the municipality with an inventory as to everything that you do. And we do this by developing these profiles, and we in these 3-page profiles per service area then serve as a bit of a snapshot as to the what, the why, the how, and everything else that falls in there. And one of the largest benefits that we find in the development of these profiles is that for the average resident or reader of this, they can walk through everything that you do, what that service looks like, what value it provides to the community, and the rationale. And that is in a lot of cases of importance to the average reader, if you will. Because, and apologies if some of you have heard me deliver this type of story beforehand, the average resident doesn't have a true appreciation as to everything that you do. There are things that you do because the province of Ontario says thou shalt do that. And there are things that you do because in order to be an effective corporation, you need to do certain things. Then there are things that we consider to be traditional, as well as things that are purely discretionary. So when I speak to this later on, and I talk about mandatory services, those are the ones where I can point to a piece of legislation that says thou shalt have. Essential services are those that, again, that are required to be an effective organization. The last two categories, and I want to just sort of specify the difference between the two, is traditional services are those that if I put you on a spectrum of municipalities of similar size, I'm going to traditionally see this service inside those municipalities. The discretionary services are those whereas they're one-offs, they're not consistent, and you really do have a choice as to whether or not you want to deliver those services or not. So that in essence is the sort of the 30,000-foot overview of the profiles, but they really do provide a picture as to the why and the what and the how in terms of the resourcing that is required to deliver all of the services that you deliver. At the same time, as we are developing these service profiles, we're looking at the structure and looking at one in terms of what we're looking at inside the structure is how many direct reports. Where do services sit inside the organization? Do they make sense? Is there the potential for things to shift around so that you can realize greater scales of economy, as well as information sharing of related services inside buckets? The third piece, and this is one that always draws some interest, is the comparative piece. And this is where we place your municipality amongst municipal peers and compare how the municipality is performing from an operational and a financial standpoint. I will say, your worship, members of council, I do want to stop here for a moment and sort of provide a bit of commentary when it comes to comparative analysis, in that it makes a few assumptions. First is, and one of the assumptions is that everybody else is doing it right. So we always have to take a look as to how and where the analysis leads us to determine whether or not we are making the correct assumption. And in some cases we can't. It's not a perfect science. The other is that this is point in time analysis. So in some cases, and for the purposes of this report, the information is coming from a full data set. So in that, for everyone's purposes, that's a 2018 financial information return. So at the time of our analysis, there were municipalities that hadn't filed theirs. So when we're looking at this, these are things that we have to take into consideration when we're looking at the comparative piece, if you will. From a process mapping standpoint, this is what I was speaking to in the previous slide, in that we took several administrative and operational processes and broke them down into individual work steps and took a look at how does paper flow, how does business inside the municipality work. And let me once again stop and say one thing. The opportunities, the issues, if you will, that we saw inside your processes are very consistent with what we see across the municipal sector. The other piece, and the other point I have to make is that I speak from a very big glass house. If anybody came inside KPMG and broke down some of our processes, they might want to break out the window and jump because of how archaic we can be as well. So this is not to be taken as criticism of how things function, if you will, but really to provide some insight as to how you could potentially reduce manual processes, duplication of efforts, physical production of paper, things of that nature, to try to free up minutes on the hour, not days of the week. But at the end of the day, our experience is that there's a lot of good that comes out of this exercise for every organization that we work with. The final piece in terms of our scope of work was to identify, again, those potential opportunities for change as to, can the municipality adjust in various ways to become more streamlined, to become more efficient, and in some cases adjust the level of service that's provided to its residents. On the fifth slide, we look at some of the key findings. And the first, and this is really that's derived from the service profiles, is looking at the nature of what you do. And from our perspective, and based upon those categories that I was speaking to earlier, the majority of what you do falls really into two buckets, either the mandatory, where it's required, or it's an essential service. And when we looked at all of the things that the municipality of Sioux Lookout does, approximately 73% falls into those two categories. When we apply a budgetary lens to it, it actually increases to 78%. So it gives you some sense as to how and where the municipality spends its money in terms of actual services, and that these are services that are largely required of you in one form or another. Financially, we looked at a variety of indicators as well as operating costs associated with the services that you provide. And your worship, members of council, the theme that I would provide you with to summarize all of it is consistency. In that what we didn't see was the municipality consistently at the high end, if you will. You generally trend toward the middle. There were some services where you were the highest inside the comparator group, but once again, recognizing point in time analysis, we were able to distinguish the why. So if we were to look at a service specifically like buildings and bylaw, that is an activity-driven service. So in a year where there's more activity, your operating costs are going to then be higher. So when we looked at all of that, what we didn't present us with was any significant flags, if you will, from a comparative standpoint. It really does then lend itself to looking at what you do as an organization as being very consistent with what we would expect of a municipality of your size in Northern Ontario. When I speak to the processes and the workflow inside the organization, what we did notice was that there is potential for change. And once again, as I said earlier, this isn't meant to be a criticism of the organization, but to provide you with some insight as to how to potentially address this. And looking at potentially formalizing processes. So you're doing something quite well. Now it's a matter of making sure that you actually put it to paper. And the analogy that I always use, and I try not to be grim because someone will always say, well, if someone got hit by a bus, I don't like to look at it that way. So if someone spiked the lottery and didn't come into work, do you have standard operating procedure? Do you have documentation that someone could come into that chair and familiarize themselves with some of your key processes in short order? And the answer is, in some cases, you don't. So what we've done inside the document is to provide some food for thought as to how to go about doing so. The other area that we looked at is the use of technology. And your worship, members of council, one of the things that was brought to our attention as we were going through the review process and identifying issues such as this is that you're already working on it, and that the organization has recognized this and is starting to build towards addressing and using tech versus manual processes that in a lot of cases present additional risk as well as inefficiencies inside the entire organization. When we looked at excuse me, sorry, on slide 6, when we looked at the organizational structure, we did notice that this is consistent with the municipality of your size within that comparator group. But with that being said, and this comes back to my point about the assumption that everybody else is doing it right, this doesn't preclude you from change. And inside the organizational review report, we've provided some models for the municipality's consideration to try to reduce the number of direct reports through to the office of the CAO to allow for more strategy versus more operational attention being applied at that position. We looked at staffing levels, and while that your pure numbers trend toward the higher end of the average, when we start to break out services and start moving them on a sort of on a service delivery and departmental basis, that's where we find that it's actually, again, somewhat consistent. There's some variances here and there, but it's not as if you were consistently at the high end across the entire organization from a staffing standpoint. The final piece was with regard to the community consultations. And your worship and members of council, community consultations typically produce two groups. And I do not proclaim ownership of defining these two groups. Someone else inside the firm has done that for me. But there are advocates and there are accountants. And the advocates are those in your community who do not care about the dollars and cents and are about the services. And when I say don't care about it, it's not as if they're writing you a blank check, but they put more value in provide me with service versus worrying about what it looks like financially. And on the flip side of that is you have the accountants, and this always gets me in trouble inside my firm where I hang out with accountants on a day-to-day basis. But with that being said, the accountants are strictly financial. They really the service is priority B. The first priority is the dollars and cents, and that is the focus. So when we did the community consultation, what it really drove home is those two camps exist inside your community. Whereas a lot of what we heard was about how certain areas were being delivered at a very high level, and public works and recreation were the two areas of focus. And that's not all that surprising. These are the two services that are the most tangible to your residents. They're the ones that they see, feel, and touch on a daily basis. So to hear that some are satisfied with these two services, and in some cases are seeking more, didn't surprise me. At the same time, that there was another group inside your community saying, no, these services are broken and they need to be fixed. So it really was a bit of a mixed message that we received from the community. But I will say, from an overall look at the opportunities that were shared, I would suggest that overwhelming support to pursue. The only opportunity that didn't receive, the majority of those respondents was the establishment of a capital levy, which I'll speak to in a subsequent slide, in the following slide. In looking at, the potential courses of action and how we go about looking at change is really in four areas. We look at operating efficiencies. So how can you go about doing things, better, if you will? We look at alternate service delivery. How could you do things differently? Service level adjustments are areas where we talk about potentially changing what you currently do. And then finally, and it doesn't require much explanation, is looking at revenue generation. So in terms of operating efficiencies, and what we saw was, the municipality is doing a lot of good things. And what was evident to us in our work is that the municipality is trying to incorporate and implement, progressive ways of doing things. So when we look at overall operating efficiencies, the things that we were looking at in some cases are housekeeping, if you will, ensuring that you've got policies in place. So the concept of policy development, particularly in the area of finance, just to make sure you've got documents that guide how you go about and doing things. Looking at, governance, in terms of your committees, do they still work? And once again, this isn't to suggest that you don't need to have committees, but it really is then the question is we've established this committee. There's no harm in establishing physicals, if you will, where every so many years you take a look and go, okay, does this committee still meet its reason for being. And if it doesn't, does it need to change, or does it need to go away? And in some cases they go away. But it's ultimately taking that time to look at that. We looked at overall, even in this case, the potential of shifting responsibilities and moving, facility and maintenance away from your development services department and into public works, where it's traditionally seen. When we talk about and some of the opportunities pertaining to the alternate service delivery, this is looking at shifting responsibilities in some cases away from the municipality and upon the community. And your worship, members of council, I know this can be in some cases a bit of a difficult conversation to have, but some municipalities have taken the stance that they no longer, they'll look to their business community to maintain flower beds for them, or sort of that beautification program isn't one that the municipality goes out and delivers in its entirety. They may fund it, they'll fund it through stipends to community groups, but then it's not municipal staff that are going out and doing this. The maintenance of outdoor rinks, in some cases, once again, stipend provided, but it becomes a volunteer driven initiative versus something that the municipality is out there doing. We looked at the concept of potentially shifting your airport away from a municipal department and turning it into a municipal service corporation, and being able then in some cases to change not necessarily the financial relationship in its entirety, where you still build in mechanisms to share upon revenues, but it allows you then in some cases to improve upon your balance sheet, if you will, because the debt that sits inside the airport or for airport services would become part of the corporation. So it would give you some flexibility from a long-term debt standpoint as well. The other concept is the operation of Cedar Bay, and looking at this facility as something that potentially could change how you go about in delivering the service in the long term. From a service level adjustment basket, the one area that we looked at was solid waste management. And your worship, members of council, this was also a topic that generated a lot of discussion from the community as part of the consultations, where they were talking about, looking for more, and at the same time, trying to deliver the service in a different way. What we were talking about here is a best practice, and something that we're starting to see as an emerging trend, particularly in Northern Ontario, is shifting away from weekly garbage collection and going to a bi-weekly schedule, particularly in the winter months. It's not one that many municipalities, again, in our neighborhoods, are going to be adopting in the summer months, because it's an opportunity to attract more wildlife, and the last thing we need to do is draw more bears into our community. I know personally I had 6 walking through at any given time for the months of June through till September. So it's something that we are looking at and providing you with the opportunity to potentially shift to that model. From a revenue generation standpoint, there were really 3 areas, and I already mentioned the capital levy, and one that wasn't all that popular with your residents. And I can appreciate that, because it really then is viewed upon as another tax. Your worship, members of council, if I may, it is another tool at your disposal to try to assist in your asset management program. It is not the silver bullet, and it will not address your infrastructure needs. But what it does do is it provides you with another stream of revenue that you can, on an annual basis, look to investing in the replacement of what you have. In the absence of consistent funding from the province and from the federal government, you really are left to your own devices, and you can only borrow so much to try to replace what you have. So this is a tool that I would suggest has gained a lot of traction inside the municipal sector over the last 5 years, as municipalities become more aware as to what their infrastructure deficit looks like. And just for your purposes, if it is something that you do want to pursue, one of the things that we suggest is there needs to be a communication piece attached to it on an annual basis. And that what you will be communicating to your residents is here is what we raised, here is where the money went. Because the last thing, your worship, members of council, you want to be seen as doing is raising money for capital and then moving it into operations. And I can tell you this much. To do so isn't what we would consider to be, common practice nor best practice. Some municipalities have done it and they're taking a significant amount of heat for it, and rightfully so. Because if you're raising the money for capital, it should go into capital. We looked at, and I talked about building, operating costs earlier in this presentation. When we looked at revenue generation under the Building Code Act, you are provided the opportunity to move to a full cost recovery model for building fees. You're not there yet. And what I'm not suggesting is that you get there tomorrow, but if you're afforded the ability to do so, and in consultation with your development community, how can you start to move fees in a direction whereas the costs to develop is borne by the developers and not by the ratepayers of the community? And this is one that, for your purposes, we do consistently see building departments across Ontario that do have fully, have run departments that were operated on a full cost recovery basis. The last piece is in general about user fees and ensuring that some housekeeping, that they're all consolidated inside one bylaw, as well as, and this comes back to my point about capital, where applicable, that you do have capital built into your user fees to ensure then any dollar that's raised for a service, there's a component in there that's going to go to the replacement of the asset that's being consumed. The final bullet point that you'll see on that slide speaks to organizational design. And as I was speaking earlier about trying to reduce and trying to restructure the organization that allows for your CAO to operate on a more strategic level versus an operational level, is to try to then ultimately reduce the number of direct reports. And inside the organizational review report, what we have done is develop 3 models. And as you walk through each of those models, what you'll notice is from the functional model down through the 2 program-based models that we've developed, is that the number of reports goes from 10 to 7, or 10 to 7 to 5 to 4. And when I talk about the difference between the two, and when we speak to the concept of the functional is in a lot of cases very close to what you currently have in place right now. And what it does though is it allows then for similar services, and services that in some cases are, if they're corporately based, they sit in one larger department, if you will. If they're in relation to planning and development services, they fall into another, community services. And as you walk through those functional models, what you'll see is the development of these clusters that allows for that functional specialization. It allows for clear control and line of sight of operations. At the same time, recognizing if you do sort of move all the way down to say that second program model that we developed, that has to be taken into account, that that span of control may become a little too large for you. But at the end of the day, it's not one that you couldn't get to. The overarching message for your worship and members of council from an organizational standpoint is to really look at doing this on an incremental basis rather than trying to do all of this at once. And inside the service review report, what we provided you with is a series of implementation tools that you can do them as you will. But it's ultimately to try to start to strategize and start to plot out a plan of attack, and how you go about and wanting to keep both of these documents as living and breathing documents in the foreseeable future as to how and what you're going to do. So with that concludes my presentation, and I'm willing to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Thanks. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great, and I apologize for that. Thanks, Councillor Cassidy, jumping in. So, I'm sorry, I missed the beginning. Have you presented just the organizational part of the report? Both
reports were inside. Yeah, we spoke to both.
I'm sorry, you've done both. So you'll take questions on both the organizational and the financial aspects. I'll start with Councillor Timpson.
Okay, yes, thanks, Chess. It was very interesting. First thing I wanted to ask is if you could possibly put that 200-page report precede into essentially what you just told us. Coles Notes version of it would be really helpful for the public, basically.
We'll just have to, before you answer that, that'll go through staff in terms of contract and what's in the contract to do, Councillor Timpson. So a good idea, but we'll determine. CIO comment? Oh, no. It's a virus. It's spreading around. There you go.
Sorry, my mouse isn't cooperating with me tonight, so I'm having a hard time getting it to go where I want it to go. Just in terms of the Coles Notes, sure, it can be done, but we have to discuss this with Mr. Anselmo, as it's not part of our contract. So I'm not sure if he's willing to do it pro bono or not.
You can have that discussion offline. I don't think it's appropriate here, but carry on, Councillor
Okay.
Timpson.
Yeah, the second thing is about the airport. I found that an interesting proposal, and it's often struck me how, the airport is essentially self-contained. It would seem to me only fair that the municipality should be able to get some of the revenue from the airport in some way, much the same way we do with Sioux Hydro, where it's a dividend. It's a corporation, business corporation, and we get a dividend from them. I like that idea. The third thing I wanted more clarification on was your comments about Cedar Bay, and you mentioned in there putting it in that it was run by the municipality. Well, a good part of Cedar Bay is run by volunteers, including the stable is totally run by a volunteer organization, and much of the activities are volunteer. I wasn't sure where that $75,000 came from, and would you be able to explain where that 75,000 came from? Because the only thing I know that the town does is basically the daycare, which.
In terms of the findings there with the cost savings, that was derived from your budget. And what I'm trying to do is just locate the lines inside the budget that we used for that analysis. But it ultimately is the operating losses that we saw that pertain to Cedar Bay. We did some analysis on a year-to-year basis, and hence why we saw that that operating loss for those that fall inside this that your cost center are increasing at a rate of approximately 13% on average on an annual basis. So the numbers, and I'm trying to go through them right now, but that was all derived through the cost center in your budget.
Okay, yeah, okay. I'd be interested in knowing a little bit more about that, because given that the main cost for the town is being the daycare, or the day camp rather. So I didn't fully grasp that in that section, but I think too, I would like to have seen a little bit more discussion about the work that is being done down there now, that it is largely in the hands of a third party already, and if it weren't, and if the town were running those services, it would be probably costing the town much more than it is already.
Any further comments or questions, Councillor Timpson?
No, that's it.
Thank you. Councillor Bennett.
Yeah, when I've read through this a couple of times, I thought, how the heck am I going to ask any questions about this? There's a lot of stuff in here. but I had some observations and some thoughts I looked at, and some of them were in the from the FIR, yeah. The financial asset divided liability, it's on the page 23, 24, 25, I think, grants to revenue and grants to capital. I was really concerned about where we sat in the group in those three columns. So I'd certainly like your comments on that. The other things that I had looked at, and it's interesting because we've just been doing our budget, first budget meeting, and I had made some comments about things that I thought we could save money on, and there's a few of them on here. So that kind of is interesting to me. Your comment about capital levy, if I would be one that was against a capital levy, or I assume this is something like a development fee. Is that the same thing we're talking about? I had a meeting with a developer probably 3 or 4 years ago, and he didn't come here, by the way, unfortunately, but he was very enthused about Tulaga not having a development charge. So that was kind of interesting. The other one you hit right on the nose, I think, are user fees. I do believe that we are very, very inconsistent with our user fees, and that's been in probably as long as I can recall in council. It just seems to be something we can never really get a handle on. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Through your worship, with respect to the grants, it is something that we looked at, because when we saw where you sat, we actually did some trend analysis and went back to look at how you've performed in other years. And I will tell you this much, these are blips. So when we look at your performance on a multi-year basis, that concern about grant revenues really wasn't there for us. With respect to the question around capital levy, this is not a development charge. This is something that would take place during the development of your budget. And it would be a separate percentage on your annual budget that you would raise and devote to capital for the entire municipality. Whereas development charges are very specific to development, if you will. Municipalities of your size in Northern Ontario, DCs are few and far between. So this is more of an infrastructure-based approach versus a development-based initiative.
We actually looked at the we actually did that and sort of do that. Actually, we call it an infrastructure charge, and we actually did set money aside for it a few councils ago or a few budgets ago. And part of our hydro dividend actually goes into that. So I think I can't remember how much of it is, if it's 100,000 or whatever. I don't recall the amount, but a part of that definitely goes into that already. So we may be doing that. You just haven't been able to find it.
Thanks, Councillor Bath. Councillor Fenlon.
Yeah, it's an interesting reading. Have to be like John, I guess, and read it twice over. Total long-term debt on households on page 22.
Yep.
Can you explain that a bit for me?
You have about $7.2 million of airport debt that sits inside that number, which drives your number up. So when we normalize that and we take that in, that's sort of what led us to looking at the airport as a potential corporation, is to get that debt off your books. And that's where it sits. And that's a determinant. That was one of the things that we looked at when we saw how high it was. In taking that, you had $7 million in airport related debt. Not to say that that it's not going to be paid back, but it's a way of potentially cleaning up, if you will, and distinguishing between two sets of books, between the airport and the municipality itself. So that's where it sits, and that's why you're high.
Okay. That's good for me then.
Thank you. Councillor Cassidy.
Yeah, Councillor Bath kind of keyed in on a couple of things I had picked out. The only other thing I had was it says the discontinuation of marina services in there. Is that in reference to boat launches?
Yeah, and through your worship, we actually had this conversation, CAO and I, about the results of the community consultations. They were referring to marinas, and you know what we're assuming is that they're speaking to the boat launches.
And would this, I guess, could this potentially also tie into what we talked about with user fees being out of whack or not fully covering costs, and potentially with the user fees actually being more more in line to cover the operating costs of the boat launches?
Well, and I think that's an area that when you're looking at user fees in general, some services you can move to a full cost recovery model. Like when I speak to the concept of building services, you could. It's going to take time. I think it doesn't matter with respect to any increases to user fees. It's going to be on an incremental basis to get to where you need to go. But for a service such as that, one thing that you want to look at is making sure that there's a capital component in there, so that the users are ultimately funding for the replacement of the asset over time.
Nope, that was it. Very good report. It's actually it's a very interesting read to go through all the pages of it. So anyone listening, it is worth it, I believe. And it's a good overview of the municipality. So thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Cassidy. Councillor Lego.
Yeah, very interesting and long read. Thanks, Chaz. I agree that we need to figure out what model, and discussions at the table need to be happening moving forward, of what model we want to have our municipality working under. I'm a fan of the program model too. Less reports going to the that's just my opinion. I like how it's broken down into the four substructures, and each piece inside of each one of those falls into place. So to me, that programming model is perfect in my mind. Well, mind you, nothing's perfect, but also whether reconstructing any of this is going to make a difference in the end, I really don't know. It's hard for me to picture how much we need to restructure to make a difference. Like you said, it's going to be incremental, so we may not see it, but it'll be, to me, that's the right move to make, is to start heading in that direction. I'll just start going through some of the, and if you want to jump in and make a comment at any time, please do. If we're going to restructure, we also need to restructure our committees and move forward with that if we decide to do that. And that was on page 37, that comment.
Yeah, through your worship, it really does give you an opportunity to marry the two. Whereas your committee structures would then be would have sort of a broader focus in sort of a portfolio.
Yeah. Again, it was brought up Cedar Bay being revenue neutral, but also the boat launches to me should be revenue neutral. They're not, because we have wages included in there, and that takes up a big chunk of the money that's coming in. So we have to, as council, sit down and figure that out as well. That's an important one for me. And again, you brought up, building inspection fees and having it cost recovery for that. I think that can work as well. I know that we're putting a lot of money into the reserves and reserve funds, and it's been pointed out in the study that we're sustainable in that aspect. Personally, I would like to see a bit more debt repayment instead of all going into reserves and reserve funds. I think there should be a bit more of a balance. To me, paying down some debt, we're saving on long-term interest payments. every quarter, $1 million is $40,000 we're saving. So it's another thing that I would like to have a discussion at the table as well. Again, user fees, they need to be incrementally increased each year and not go, oh yeah, we need to make up some money and surprise our residents and taxpayers with a big increase. So as Councillor Bath has indicated many times, that it should be incrementally increased. And I totally agree with him. And again, what was brought up, the airport, that we need to have that discussion at the table with the airport. And if, you know, even if it's just on the books being two different corporations, but still together, it may alleviate when people are looking at our accounts, some of the shock that we see, because there is a lot of debt in the airport. Let's see what else I written down. I think that is everything. Oh, well, and also the plan that you've talked about, that we need to sit down, figure out which direction we're going, and we need to get feedback multiple times a year on where we're at and how things are moving. So
Yeah.
thank you
through
very
your
much
worship.
for making me read that twice, as Councillor Bass said.
I will say, through your worship, I've never been accused of being bereft. But I will say this much in terms of the comment about implementation. That is one that, you know, making sure that this becomes a living and breathing document, and ensuring that you maintain some momentum. So we hope that the tools that we provided you with really will assist you in doing so.
Oh, one more thing. Capital levy. To me, what we're putting into reserves and reserve funds is a capital levy, because a lot of it goes into the reserves that are for those things. So, you know, we're putting in, I don't know, $1 million, million something a year into reserves and reserve funds. So it's, and yes, that there is $100,000, as Mr. Bath or Councillor Bath said, from the hydro dividend that goes into the infrastructure levy. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Councillor Lego. Yeah, I echo the very interesting comments from all councillors, very informative, and lots of material for discussion and change, I would say. I'd just like to ask, I'll focus just a few things in my questions on comments on the financial parts. It's a 3-year comparison, which I understand there are limitations. Your 5 years, certainly 10 years will show trends. 5 years will probably be a bit more informative on trends. 3 years you can pick up a real blip and it looks, you don't know which way it's going. Was that an outlier or was that normal? Just a comment, but I certainly like the fact that we looked at 3 years. Would you ever look at 5? Isn't 3 year normal?
Typically we do 3. We're not married to 3. It's just one that we consistently use.
Yeah. Okay. The comparator towns, interesting. I know you picked and you gave the parameters. You picked, I think, on population. They were in Northern Ontario and a few other factors. When I look at them, and it's difficult to get comparator towns. Sometimes you can get a mill town that looks like another mill town in the north. We're not. I look at well, still look out. We're not an industry town. We had the Hudson Mill at one point, which was a significant industry, but wasn't the primary. It was the primary industry in terms of industrial use, but it wasn't probably the primary employer. At the same time, we had the Canadian military, and we had the CN and the tourism market, and we've shifted to something else. I look at some of the other municipalities that we've been compared to. Dryden still has, even though the mill is half or a third of what it used to be, Dryden has a mill, which still produces to the economy and tax base. Fort Francis, I think now has lost their mill completely, but had a mill for decades. That was the town for decades. And so their financial record and history is impacted, their current place in time is impacted by having had a mill for all those years. Greenstone, a real outlier for me. I mean, Greenstone has 50% of its tax base is raised from Transcanada, the pipeline, the natural gas and the pipelines running through Greenstone. It's a huge area, and they get 50% of their tax from the pipelines. They probably provide no service to those pipelines. It's remarkable. And then they're an outlier because some of the financial things I saw with them, how did you, well, I don't want to be too harsh on anybody, but they're an outlier because they're 50%. Hearst, I'm assuming, still has an active mill, as does Iroquois Falls. Am I correct there? Michelle would know probably. No, not Iroquois Falls, but there were huge mill towns. That was really for years. And then Red Lake, which has always been a mining town, and it's a very active mining town. So when you say comparators, I know population, and they're in the north, but there are some significant differences. Our dependence on the residential tax base because of those industrial differences is huge. But then you also look at some of the things in the differences. Are the towns growing or are they shrinking? So are they investing in expanding infrastructure or not? Are the house values going up, staying stable, or going down? So the assessment values in many of those towns are quite different in terms of cost to replace, for example, or speculative cost. How much new construction is there? How many jobs are available? What's the average and the median age in those communities? You have to pick comparators. I get it, and I think you've done a fantastic job. But there are still huge differences when you look at these.
Yeah, through your worship, that is always one of probably the hardest tasks in doing these reviews is selecting the comparators, because in some cases you may based upon the composition of your community and what your economy looks like, you may look like a municipality 5 times your size in terms of those service-based economies versus industry-based. So it's something that, that is why, when I was talking about the comparative analysis, we always have to sort of look at it through the lens that there is no perfect comparator, and that we select these on the basis of trying to compare as best as we possibly can, recognizing that some of those points that you've raised can have an impact upon services per se. At the same time, it also can change the inventory of facilities that they have access to and all of that. So these are things that, we always have to take into account when we do the comparative analysis, recognizing that no one on this list is a perfect comparator to your municipality as well.
And I apologize for the technical difficulties I missed. You probably covered some of that in the first part of your presentation. When I think about comparators, and it's not necessarily in terms of size, but in the Northwest, Kenora and Thunder Bay are more comparable to Sioux Lookout in terms of the kind of services, the type of town we are, even though we're a small town. Airport, the airport and how important it is to Thunder Bay, how important it is here, education. Yeah. What a big employer it is in Thunder Bay, what a big employer it is here, healthcare, same thing. But they have different influences too. Even on the tourism, we know now that the tourism industry in the Sioux Lookout area and some other towns like Pickle Lake, Ignace, Dryden, probably we're so dependent on the American market, almost completely dependent on it. Unlike when you go farther west and farther east, there's a little bit more mix of domestic and international in the tourist market and the ability to attract. So it's a huge difference there. I think one of the things that is moving forward and direction, and I had a brief discussion with the CAO prior to the meeting, just 2 minutes. Quite frankly, Council, we need another meeting to just go through this report alone. I know we have many other reports that have been completed, from sports tourism to, let me see,
Through you, Mayor Lawrence, we have the sports tourism strategy. We have the community safety and well-being plan that's going to be wrapped up in the new year. We have the municipal services delivery review, the organizational review, our strategic plan, our economic strategic review. So there's a number of studies that were done this year and reports that were done that we have to collate, and council has to set their priorities in conjunction with conversations with staff, and then establish timelines to achieve what it is we'd like to achieve and consolidate with consolidation of all these reports.
And boy, when I look at this one and all the material here, this is not one special meeting of council. This to me is probably two special meetings of council to get through this and make some decisions and direction moving forward. Sorry, staff, but I just think there's a lot to be considered in these reports, important stuff for the municipality, and then all the other reports. I'm not sure, maybe Chaz or CAO, I'll go back to you and just ask you, in terms of this specific report and project, where do we go from here? Acknowledging that I think once Chaz has done his work and it's left with us, then we have work to do.
If I may, Mayor Lawrence, Councillor Howie has joined the meeting, so perhaps he would like to make comments on the report before we move forward.
I see him now down in the corner there. Yeah, thanks. Councillor Howie, we've been around the table and just had comments and questions. I'm not sure when you came in. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And I apologize for my late entry to the meeting. With the fire department, we were responding to a call. Yeah, thank you, Chaz, for your development of a very thorough report. I enjoyed many of your comments and things like reorganization of the committees to establish efficiencies under council's direction, and as things have changed drastically in our municipality since many of these were established. You highlighted that Cedar Bay was designed to initially be revenue neutral, but is consistently experiencing losses each year and costing. That is something worth exploring as well. The processes within our own municipal government, finding those efficiencies within programs, including the introduction of software, and to eliminate or reduce the risk or that the municipality is exposed to, and managing control at the same time. Something like the airport becoming its own separate corporation, reducing the risk at the municipal level and establishing a board led by experts for that organization. The revenue generation streams, having consistency across our user fees, and then also a consistency across departmental practices that you've outlined in your report. The restructuring of the municipal organizational chart itself through the amalgamation of various departments or departments coming under the umbrella of another, ultimately seeing a reduction in the amount of direct reports to the CAO. I had a question about this. Would you, in this process, ultimately be suggesting a reduction in the overall staff complement as a result of these efficiencies, processes, and this overall reorganization?
In terms of, through your worship, with respect to the efficiencies that are identified inside the service delivery review, I would suggest probably not. And the reason I say that is when we start talking about the process change, in large part, the changes that are being put forward inside those process maps are going to free up minutes on the hour, not days onto the week and weeks onto the months type of thing. And not to be either way, it's not as if this is going to result in so much capacity. And maybe, maybe I'm presuming an outcome, but in my experience, it doesn't result in freeing up so much capacity that you have people looking for work in terms of things to do inside their departments. With respect to the overall pursuit and change around the organizational structure, that is something that may come into play as the departments get moved around. There is that potential right now, and it's even if I look at it from look at that first functional model, I wouldn't suggest that you're going to be in that position immediately. This is something that may evolve over time.
Okay, thank you. And I look forward to how we as council can work with this report that you've developed to influence the practices and establishing a clear direction going forward for the municipality. And I also appreciate the processes and the layout of these algorithms you've presented. It, based highly in fact, highly objective, and I appreciate that presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So council, maybe I'll just do a quick once round again for any final comments or questions. Councillor Timpson?
No, I enjoyed the report. Thank you very much, Chaz, and thanks for all the other comments from the other council members. I just did want to mention one. We did try to do the development charges about 10 years ago, and it fell flat. And I guess just one of the comments is it's hard enough to get a developer here, let alone charging him or her to be here. Well, I was just going to mention that when that came up. So, thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Bath?
As everybody speaks, you hear something else I wish I'd have thought about, but it's good. It's a lot of so much in this report to read. My concern is that we have a lot of reports to deal with, and we need to establish a priority of when we deal with them. I mean, I don't want to go back and find this report in a box, or the next council find this report in a box. I feel it has priority because it deals with things we're doing and money. Your description about comparators, you mentioned it several times at the beginning of your talk about, and then the fact that there's an accountant group and an advocate group. We heard that so much in the last few years in our council meetings, how it was always better in the other communities, how they did their budgets, and our way was so backwards. And yet here we are, you're telling us the same things really. And it's really nice to hear that from an outside person. Because we always felt we did a reasonably good job, as best we could for the community. But quite often by the accountant group, your accountant group, they said absolutely not. So that was good. I like that. Thanks for that.
Councillor Fallon?
Can't say too much. I can hardly hear you people. My screen tells me my internet is unstable. So I'm done, I guess. Thanks anyway. It's a good report, and I'm sure we'll talk about it again someday.
Thank you. Councillor Cassidy?
No, I don't have anything further to add. I think, again, it was a very, very thorough report and it was very good. So, again, more work for us going forward and how we roll this out and implement it. So, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Lego?
Yeah, I agree with Councillor Bath that I hope we don't find this in a box 5 years down the road. It needs to be brought to the table more times than not. We need to get a plan and marry that with our strategic plan moving forward. And I think what I would like to see is for us to strike a balance between what the advocates want and what the accountants want. So that's our job. That's why we get the big bucks.
Councillor Lego, I think that's probably what we're always striving to achieve. You get the voices both at the council table and in the public that are at both ends of the spectrum, and ultimately you've got to drive your car down the middle of the road. So that's where we'll go. I think staff, I know discussion with staff over the last couple of months with CAO, there's no intention of putting this on a shelf. I think staff were looking forward to this as much as we were, and there's ideas in there that they want to discuss with council for implementation. So I think it's fair to say the direction from council CAO is that we'd like to see a special meeting in the new year, and I won't hold you to a time, but before the end of winter, which comes when, March the 23rd. So if that's early in the new year, I'm giving you that much leeway. I think it should be a special meeting of council to discuss this and nothing but this. I think we could devote a meeting to this, and also in the organization of other reports, how we're going to attack that. CAO?
Yes, just a few comments. Yes, Your Worship, the full intent of this review, of course, we applied for funding for it, and the province wants to see us find efficiencies. That was the whole point of the funding program. So we fully intend on taking Chaz's recommendations. A lot of them, as Chaz has said, we are already working on. So that's part of our process that we can bring council to light as to what the timelines are to get some of these efficiencies and some of these projects into place. In addition to to this report, the strategic plan, what the clerk and I have done, Brian and I have done as far as the strategic plan is there was a number of outcomes that council wanted to see with specific initiatives. So we took the liberty of kind of putting that together with timelines. So what we want to do is kind of marry those two reports together and present them to council with recommendations as per the recommendations from KPMG in this report. We want to bring forward our recommendations on what we think council should follow through on and the reasons why, and not follow through on for the reasons why. So we haven't sat down and discussed it yet, but we will be coming forward with those initiatives to discuss with council and find out if your priorities are aligning with our recommendations.
And could you say that would be early in the new year by the definition I gave you, or?
By the end of March, yes.
Okay, winter is long here. You know, sometimes it extends into May even.
I think ideally January is usually pretty hectic because of year end and finalizing the budget. But in previous talks with our clerk, Brian McKinnon, and I plan on discussing this report too with our management team because our management team has not seen it yet. So it involves buy-in from the management team too as well to come up with a plan to move this forward with council. So we'll be discussing it at the management level as well, and then coming forward with something for council to take a look at and start those discussions and establish our priorities and timelines to facilitate some of these initiatives.
Thank you. I think, Chaz, nothing is ever perfect. No municipalities, systems, and organizations is ever perfect, nor will it be. But from time to time, there's always change, and from time to time, maybe there's needs for a bit more rigorous change. But from reading the report, I'd say we're a lot less imperfect than some people think we are, and a lot less perfect than we'd like to be. But we're probably middle of the road in terms of municipalities, or maybe even better than I'm not sure. So, Chaz, do you have any final comments?
Well, yeah, first I would like, to echo, I think what you said is that, yeah, you're right. There is nothing so perfect that it cannot be improved upon. But, you know, as we walk through your processes, as I said, throughout this presentation, there's a lot of good going on. There's obviously areas where you can improve upon. I think to conclude, you know, my hope is that this is something that, you know, continues to breathe for your community. And I'd just like to thank your staff for their efforts. We recognize that these reviews are an additional work task, and your staff have been exceptional to work with. The level of responsiveness to requests for information is one that we don't typically see. So in terms of how quick we were getting what we were asking for. So I just wanted to make sure that council is aware as to their buy-in and their support of this process allowed us to really get to this point. So, you know, they were fantastic to work with. I just wanted to make sure we shared that. And then finally, just to thank you once again as a community in selecting KPMG to lead these two reviews for you, recognizing the importance of them for your community going forward. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chaz. So Brian, you can disappear behind your virtual screen and pop out in a Superman style. And Michelle, if you had one, you could do that too. I'm sure that recognition is well deserved. Thank you.
Thank you.
So unless there's anything else, we would do a confirmatory bylaw. Is that correct? We're ready for that, CAO? Correct. Yep.
Yes.
So thanks again, Chaz, on behalf of council. Good job, well done. And I apologize for the delay in starting. No idea. Council, I used that system this morning and it worked. Didn't do anything to it, and it came back, and I wasn't able to use it. I don't know.
It's the way of 2020, Your Worship. No apologies necessary.
All right, thank you. So
all the best.
Confirmatory bylaw number 99-20 to confirm the proceedings of the special council meeting of December 15th. Moved by Councillor Timpson, seconded by Councillor Bath. All in favor? Carried. And as we don't need a motion to adjourn, we just sort of fizzle out here. We'll see you all tomorrow.
Thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Take care.
Good evening, everyone.
Everyone.
Thanks again, Joe.
Good night.
Yep.